Francis Marion. Do you know who he is? Here's a clue. He was born the same year as George Washington. And honestly, he had almost as an esteemed history as George Washington. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt, and I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. And the topic is Francis Marion, one of the great leaders of liberty in American history. Going to get into that. Going to talk about that a little bit. And then I have a great guest coming up, Mark Meadows. Yes, the Mark Meadows, the former chief of staff for Donald J. Trump in the White House. He's going to come on and talk about, guess what? Liberty. But before I get into all this great, bold, and blunt topics of discussion, I want to give a shout out to the newest platform for Bold and Blunt. It is Edify, edifi.app/podcasts. Go online, type in edifi.app/podcasts, and you can find Bold and Blunt there, posted, offered to you to download and listen to, along with all the other faith-based podcasts that Edify offers. It's a great platform for those seeking some sort of Christian-based or faith-based sense out of today's political and cultural events. And you can also, of course, get Bold and Blunt at Washington Times, washingtontimes.com. Just go there, find my hyperlinked name on the page, click on it, scroll to the bottom of one of my commentaries, and there you can get directions on how to sign up to my 3 times a week newsletter, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, delivered right to your email box by lunchtime, in time for lunch hour. And including in this newsletter are all my commentaries as well as my twice weekly podcasts that come out on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I would be honored. I really would be honored to have you as a regular listener of my podcast and as also a subscriber to my Washington Times newsletter. It would really make my day if you'd check it out, if you'd sign up. And I'd also like to ask you, go to washingtontimes.com and check out all the great text that is posted there online every day. There are great staffers at the Washington Times, and I can tell you, they're bringing you the news. They're bringing you the opinions. They're bringing you the facts and analysis that the mainstream media doesn't want you to hear about, read about, or know about. So if you want to take off MSNBC, go to Washington Times and check out the real news, the real facts. Thanksgiving's coming. Prepare yourself. You know there's always one liberal in that holiday gathering, so you need the bullet points in order to beat back the socialist, communist, Marxist commentary that's coming to your dinner table. Okay, Francis Marion. Who is he? Francis Marion was born in 1732, same year as George Washington. And whereas George Washington went on to command all the American armies, in charge of thousands of men, in charge of hundreds of cannons, in charge of leading up some of the biggest battles against the British, George Washington, who went on and became known as the father of our country, Francis Marion also fought, but did it a little bit differently. He was a leader of very small groups of militiamen. He didn't have thousands of troops at his disposal. He didn't have hundreds of cannons. He didn't even have, for the most part, any kind of military equipment. He had small groups of militiamen who mostly were very poor. He never commanded more than 100 men at a time. And guess what? They owned their own guns. They brought their own guns, their own gunpowder, their own horses into battle. They even supplied their own food. Some didn't even have guns. They used swords. And here's the really inspiring thing. None of them were paid. Francis Marion didn't draw a government check for his service to the military, and none of his militia members were paid. Whereas George Washington was known as the father of our country, Francis Marion became known as the Swamp Fox. You've probably heard through history, depending on where you went to school, you've probably heard of his stories of bravery. But if you haven't, here's basically how he operated. He would swoop into a British encampment in the dead of night. He would steal redcoats' supplies and ammunition and horses. And then he'd steal back just as quietly back into the swamps of South Carolina. He was like a ghost, and he constantly frustrated the British. There was even one British commander who made it his mission in life to root out and arrest Francis Marion. But it wasn't the Swamp Fox's military might that was his most admirable trait. It was his love for liberty. Here's a story. Here's a true story. One time, Francis Marion took British soldiers as prisoners. He kept them because he wanted to eventually exchange them for American prisoners. He set up a meeting with a British officer to discuss the exchange. He invited the British officer to his own militia members' encampment. They talked. Francis Marion invited the officer, the British officer, to share a meal, and the officer said yes. Much to the British officer's surprise, dinner was only roasted sweet potatoes and water. And the British officer turned to Francis Marion and said, "Is this all your men eat?" And Francis Marion said, "Yes, though sometimes there aren't even any potatoes." And the British officer said, "Surely you must be well paid for your efforts." And Francis Marion said, "Nope, not paid anything." And the British officer asked, "Then why do you fight?" And Francis Marion answered, "Because, sir, I am in love with liberty." The British officer went back to his camp, his own British camp, and resigned his commission from the army. He told his commanding officer that they would never defeat men living on roots and river water while fighting for freedom. What an American story. This is what America needs right now. More Francis Marions. More patriotic Americans driven by such a deep-seated love of liberty, fueled by such a love of freedom that no obstacle can prevent freedom from going forward. Men and women of America need to take heart in the spirit upon which our nation was founded. The spirit of George Washington, right? Overcoming all odds, losing so many battles and determined to continue on and turning to a higher authority, praying for our nation and ultimately defeating the greatest military in the world at that time. Francis Marion, in charge of fewer than 100 men, swooping in to British encampments, swooping out from British encampments, with winds driving them forward, all out of a love of liberty. America needs this spirit right now because the left, the Democrats, the socialists, the progressives, the communists, the Marxists, the Bolsheviks, the however you want to term it, it's all one and the same. The collectivists that have taken root and taken control of the Democrat Party and are rapidly trying to exploit and steal America's resources for globalist purposes, for the few global elites to control. These enemies of America are coming on strong, and it's going to take some concerted, determined, spiritually minded, godly people to fight back. People who aren't afraid that they don't have enough votes at the ballot box or they don't have enough whatever. People who just put aside all considerations of what they see with their eyes in the material world, in the secular world, push that aside and say, I don't care, I love freedom too much. I'm going to fight for American liberties. I'm going to fight for the state of the Constitution. I'm going to fight for freedoms for my children and yours. They draw their lines in the sand and they say, Democrats, collectivists, you cannot cross here. You cannot enter. This is what we need more of in America. My guest today, Mark Meadows, former Chief of Staff for Donald J. Trump, one of America's greatest defenders of individual God-given liberties, is here today on Bold and Blunt to talk about his new book, The Chief's Chief, but also the role of faith in politics and how his personal faith actually is what drove him into politics in the first place, and how he carried that faith into politics and how it guided his moral compass, just as founding fathers intended this nation to be governed. Once you take out God from government, you have a government that is morally adrift. And this is how Democrats, this is how the socialists and progressives and communists and collectivists enter. So, Mark Meadows, thank you so much for being here on Bold and Blunt. I really appreciate your time.
Well, it's great to be with you, Cheryl, and obviously when you take a bold and blunt approach, it's really good medicine for the country, because right now, as you know, our liberties and our freedoms are under attack. So thank you for bringing the truth to the American people.
Well, you're a perfect guest for Bold and Blunt, because you just epitomize that, and especially your Christian viewpoints, which I do want to touch on. But first, I see by looking through your Twitter feed that you're not really a fan of Joe Biden's border policies.
No, the real problem with his border policy is that there is no policy. It's an open border kind of approach. He's put out a welcome mat at our southern border, and that's in violation to not only our Constitution but the laws of the land. And yet they act like they've got a secure border, and now what they're talking about, and I think this is the frustrating thing for me, is now they're talking about paying up to $450,000 for people that came here illegally, were separated, and because of the emotional trauma, the American taxpayer is going to foot the bill. And and sadly, that kind of money is more than many Americans can make in a decade. So it is just very, very troubling just to see where Joe Biden is and where he's not. And obviously, he's talking climate abroad instead of actually going to our southern border.
That $450,000, that doesn't just seem unlawful or unconstitutional, but it just seems downright immoral to me, because I'm not a big fan of using tax dollars for entitlement spending. But if we're going to spend $450,000 on an individual or family, then I would much rather have it go to, say, some inner city family that is struggling, but are citizens of America.
Well, without a doubt, and I mean, so if they're struggling and we've got taxpayer dollars going to go to a particular program, that's what it should be. Or how about this? First responders who are either injured or lose their life in service to their community and country. Why don't we take that same dollars and give it to those families? I can tell you, this is all about sending a message to the far left. And it's coming in the forms of George Washington's 450,000 of them. But the real problem is it is a sue and settle kind of deal that's being contemplated by the Biden administration, which will set in motion. Not only will it just stop at the little less than 1,000 claims right now, but it will continue to go on with everybody saying they're emotionally distressed and that they should get a big check from the American taxpayer. It just is not right, and quite frankly, it's hopefully something that the American people will speak up about, and Biden will abandon it.
Now, you as former chief of staff to President Donald Trump, you have this new book that is coming out in December, which I see on Amazon is already making top 10 bestseller lists, which is, that's pretty good a month in advance. Congratulations on that. But no wonder, it's titled The Chief's Chief, and you're giving some insider views of how it was in the Donald Trump White House. Can you detail anything that maybe people haven't heard about the inner workings of the White House with your service with former President Trump?
Well, I can do that, Cheryl, and thank you for highlighting that. It's interesting. I got all kinds of offers to write negative books about Donald Trump, and I got offered a whole lot more money to do that. The problem is it would have had to have been a work of fiction from my perspective. He was able to accomplish unbelievable things in just 4 years. And so let me just bring your listeners inside the room real quick. It was, if you go back to some of the difficulty that we were having during the COVID shutdown economically on small businesses, this is a president that not only brought me in, but brought others in and said, we've got to make sure that we allow the great economy to continue to expand and get out of the way. So he says, get Vladimir Putin on the line, get the King of Saudi Arabia on the line. If you recall back then, oil dropped very significantly, ended up going negative. But this is a guy that wanted the leaders on the line with him that said, we're going to lose thousands of jobs across America if we don't get this right, and proceeded to have a 2-hour phone call with the two leaders of the top 2 oil-producing nations, and literally negotiated a deal right then to try to make sure that not only oil prices continue to stay reasonable for Americans, but that didn't go artificially too low and cost thousands, if not tens of thousands of jobs. So he was willing to engage, and here's the one, I highlight this in the book. He told Vladimir Putin and the King of Saudi Arabia oil was going to go to zero. At that point, oil was still in the $20 a barrel range. No, it's not going to go to zero. They kept pushing back. Indeed, not only did it go to zero, but it went negative. And then at that point, the president said, buy as much oil as you can. We want the American taxpayers to benefit from this. Even if you got a federal bathtub, fill it up with oil. And those are the kind of stories that, honestly, most people will never hear about. But if they buy the book, they've got there's a few villains in there, as you can well imagine. Secretary Esper and General Milley sabotaging the president kind of behind the scenes, as was Dr. Fauci. And
Dr. Fauci.
Talk about the 3 sides of every coin that Dr. Fauci would choose. And so I bring you inside the room, sometimes in a humorous way, but more importantly, talking about the great accomplishments that Donald Trump was able to get across in just his first term.
Let me ask you, what did you think of Anthony Fauci when you first met him? What did you think of his work when he was on the public platform dictating policy and saying that he wasn't dictating policy? And that's my particular spin. You can refute that if you want.
Well, no, you're 100% right, Cheryl, because not only was he dictating policy, but he was doing that without really the approval of the White House. And so he would come in and he would make statements, and I'd call him up. I'd say, Tony, why did you make that statement? 1, it's not based on fact. 2, you weren't authorized to speak on it. I mean, he was in front of more cameras and more microphones, and in the short period of time that we ended up having COVID, it became a household name. Obviously throwing out the first pitch for the Nationals game, it was a little bit to the left, like his policy is, and so I highlight that. I think one of the interesting things, people ask me, well, why didn't President Trump fire him? And I can tell you that there were a number of times where there was a recommendation to let him go, and even at that point, he had been made into such a celebrity status that we were afraid that some of the negative fallout that, quote, we weren't listening to science. Not only were we listening to science, but we were challenging each particular position to make sure it was based on science. But Dr. Fauci's rhetoric doesn't necessarily correspond with science, and I point that out in the book as well.
Yeah, and it was a real danged if you do, danged if you don't situation. If President Trump had fired Fauci, he would have taken fire from the media, and if he didn't, as he didn't, he fielded fire. So really, it was a no-win for him. But I want to talk a little bit more about you and your personal faith, because I was reading a piece. It was in Christian Broadcast News, Christian Broadcast Network, and it was a few years ago where you credited God for your entry into politics, that you had never planned on being a congressman before, and it was due entirely to God. So tell me how that faith helped you in your service in politics, and more importantly, how you brought that faith into the White House.
Well, I can tell you it's my faith in my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ that makes all the difference in the world. And you're right, I was never planning on my bucket list. There was never being a member of Congress. In fact, I had a great life without being a member of Congress. I'm kind of a shy individual, and the very fact that I'm having to do TV and talk to you here on this broadcast makes it a little challenging for me, because I was always a guy that didn't want to do that. But here's the thing that it does. If we look at our faith, and we look at really what our founding fathers set forth was that freedom of religion, and it's not just my faith, but a freedom of religion for a variety of faiths and the protection of those things. We find that they're being challenged again today, like they were many times in the very early times of what made pilgrims and others come across to this great country we now call home. But for me, it's always making sure that the true north is something that is morally good and right, and in doing so, hopefully we treat people with respect. But we are bold in knowing what is right and what is wrong, and candidly, we're willing to speak out about that, regardless of our reputation. And sometimes when you're in politics, the reputation gets attacked more vigorously than we would hoped. But for me, it's having my quiet time each and every morning, and I talk a little bit about that in the Chief's Chief as well. Where literally it's having that compass. How does that play out in the White House? Obviously, it was people of faith, many of them who not only prayed for President Trump when he was candidate Trump, but then continued to do so in terms of the policies. I would say there's never been a more pro-life president than Donald Trump. Even though when he ran, that was a big question mark, and he ended up being one of the top, if not the very top, certainly in the top two in terms of presidents and pro-life initiatives. But then it's also about religious liberty, and I want to stress that, because the religious liberty aspect of that, we look now in this cancel culture of what's politically correct and what it's not. And he was willing to stand up for those that maybe even had a faith that was very different than his. And so it was making sure that those voices were heard in the White House. Sometimes we focus far too often in an administration on just the policy, and we leave what's important to moms and dads and aunts and uncles on Main Street out of the equation. And so we tried to bring that in.
And he was very pro-Israel, too. He was the president that finally moved the embassy,
you're
right?
Exactly right, Cheryl. I mean, I can tell you, and you and I have shared that story where literally presidents before him had all promised to move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and yet it was this president who fulfilled his campaign promise and did exactly that. And so he has been willing to stand with Christians and Jews and many of other faiths as well to make sure that this constitutional protection that we hold dear is not invaded upon.
So let me go back to what you said a couple minutes ago about speaking out strongly as a Christian, and you do it with tact and so forth, but you're still strong in your beliefs for America. Isn't it frustrating to you? It is to me. Isn't it frustrating to you when Christians say, well, I don't want to get too involved in politics because I want to live in this world but not of this world, and Jesus commands us to follow the leaders we have in place, and so forth and so on?
Well, the scripture is very clear. It said, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar." So that had basically a connotation back to the Old Testament times. But it also is very, very clear of the culture that you're in. And if you look back to our founding fathers and you look back to the early days of not only the Constitution, but the laws, the way they were driven, it was a moral and just society that was actually putting that forth. And so to suggest that we want to live in a society that is not based on that moral compass, it just won't work. Our founding fathers told us it wouldn't work, and so my encouragement to all of those that are listening is it's very important that you get engaged. Not necessarily run for office, but certainly what we have to do as people of faith is to speak up and let our voice be heard. And when we don't, what happens is that vacuum is filled with someone. And generally, now it's someone from the left who's saying that our values don't matter. And so, my encouragement to all those that are tuned in right now is to stay involved, whether it's in your local church, your local community, your state level. If you've prayed about it and feel like you need to run for office, listen, we need great men and women who are willing to serve in office and that don't actually want to be in Washington, D.C. The ones that I get concerned about is where it is on their bucket list and all they've wanted to be is a member of Congress all their life. That's a problem. And if you've got somebody in your community that's there, those are generally not the people that you want to support because they're in it for the wrong reason.
Yep. And speaking of running for office, you seem to think that that Donald Trump is going to run again in the next presidential election. Let me ask you this. How do you really know? Because it seems to me like this, I don't know Donald Trump. I've never met Donald Trump. But following him in the political world, it just seems like he's a hard guy to predict his next move. So how can you say that with any sort of certainty?
Well, it's interesting. I want to make clear to all your listeners, I don't work for President Trump any longer. I'm not part of his campaign team. He does like to keep people guessing, and you're right. And I think at this point, the big decision is whether he runs or whether he actually encourages someone else to run that would carry on some of the policies and the agenda that he has. I can tell you that he has put together some of the people on his team that are reaching out to certain areas like Iowa and South Carolina and places that you generally wouldn't do that unless you were going to have an influence in the early days of a Republican primary. And so that's one of the tells that's there. But he's not made a decision. I was actually with President Trump and the First Lady Melania Trump over on the fourth game of the World Series. So I was with him there as he saw the Braves win, and so there's no definitive decision. At the same time, if his health continues to stay good, he will either run or he will be intimately involved in someone who does run, and I know there are a number of people out there making the same kind of rounds in those states like Iowa and others.
And I know our time's coming to an end, so let me just finish with this question. Whether it's Donald Trump who runs or someone else, what would you say is the most important issue facing America right now, or maybe the top 2 or 3 most important issues facing America?
Protecting our freedoms, whether those be economic freedoms, religious freedoms, freedom from a standpoint of being able to stay engaged in the public square, those are coming under attack, and it's at the local level in communities, and certainly at the church level, it is coming under attack each and every day. Secondly, the biggest thing that I continue to see is the socialist nature of the far left and what's happening, and they're actually bringing those kind of values in from communist countries that do not serve the first part that I talked about in the number one priority very well, because whether it's socialism or communism that actually comes to bear, it ultimately hurts those freedoms. And so whether it's economic freedom or religious freedom, we've got to push back to the far left, and so I see that's the second attack. The third is this whole cancel culture, where they're canceling anybody with a conservative voice. The very fact that you have this broadcast and where people are listening to this podcast, there is with unbelievable fervor, the desire to cancel this, not to give a platform. The publishers of our book, they actually were canceled from two of the largest publishing houses in New York.
Really?
Because they were publishing conservative books. It's one of the reasons I went with them. I said, listen, if you guys are going to get canceled, I will go with this new group, All Seasons Press, coming out of like I say, one with Simon & Schuster, the other with Hachette, and both of them got canceled because they did conservative, and they wanted to do pro-Trump books. And so, if nothing more, I was going to put my vote and my money with someone who had been canceled, and so I'm hopeful that we can stand up against this cancel culture to make sure your voice and the voice that goes directly to the American people is not stifled and stamped out.
That's a very good list. I think I agree with those top three concerns. The only thing I would add to it is to specify under protecting freedoms, guaranteeing American citizens the right to decide whether or not they can vaccinate themselves or not. The vaccine mandates I find very wicked.
It goes without saying, mandates, whether they're vaccine mandates or whether they're mask mandates, listen, it is critical. I've got family members right now that are facing potentially being terminated from their job because they're not wanting to take the vaccine, and yet we've got first responders. And so since you've hit on this, we've got first responders in New York City and other states that are being fired and let go because they are not willing to succumb to this vaccine mandate. It needs to be a personal choice for them based on their religious beliefs or based on their doctor's information. But here's the interesting thing is, they were the same people that we asked to rush in during COVID, the first responders and the healthcare workers, without giving any real concern for their health and safety and welfare. We asked them to be part of an essential personnel, and now we're going to punish them. There's something wrong with an administration that does that to look at it that short-sighted. So I would agree with you on that.
Yep, something wrong, very wrong, something wicked this way comes is what comes to mind. Mark Meadows, remarkable American patriot, author of The Chief's Chief. I'm going to pray that God continues to expand your influence because it's people like you whose voices are very much needed in this culture and politics. Thank you for being on Bold and Blunt with me.
Well, God bless you. Thank you so much, and continue to pray for our great country.
Absolutely. Continue to pray for the great country of America. There's a phrase that will send the left into a tizzy. Not only is it putting forth America as great, but it's suggesting that prayer is the way to save America. Boy, does the left hate thinking that, right? Anyhow, that is the way to save America, first and foremost, turning to God. It's what the Founding Fathers did. It's what patriotic Americans continue to do today because they know that this nation cannot last in its form that founding fathers intended, in its system of God-given rights, individual liberties coming from a creator, not from government, that such a system cannot last without moral men and women in the culture, that a limited government requires moral, virtuous people. Otherwise, government has to come in and control all. And that's where the left wants to take America. That's rapidly where America is headed today. Thank you for listening. Check out Bold and Blunt at edify.app/podcasts. That's edify, edifi.app/podcasts. Or just go right to WashingtonTimes.com and get Bold and Blunt there. Download it. Subscribe to it. Subscribe to my 3 times a week Washington Times commentary-filled newsletter. And as always, thank you so much for listening. Very much appreciated. Tune in next time. And in the meanwhile, stay blunt, stay bold.